Hello, everybody, and welcome to this third in our series of 3 sessions on nonviolent tactics and strategies in winning campaigns. Today, we focus on the campaign that successfully ousted Dictator of 1988. Key question we posed is, what can we learn from this campaign about winning nonviolent campaigns today? My name is Richard Sandbrook, and I'm from Science for Peace. And this series is a joint production of Science for Peace and the Voice of Women for Peace. And as well, we have a number of people who have endorsed, organizations that have endorsed the 3 sessions as well, for whom I'm very grateful for their publicity and assistance. Before saying more about today's session, may I ask your indulgence to briefly make a request? Science for Peace has been sponsoring an e-petition to the House of Commons to require legislation to restrict the production and export of oil and gas from Canada over time. So please, if you agree with the petition, sign on. Now, to find this e-petition, please do this. Go to Google e-petition 4225, e-petition 4225. That will provide you with the link. We're getting very close to the 500 signatures required, but we only have 1 week in which to ensure we do have well over 500 in case there are any duplicates or ones that are disallowed by the House of Commons staff. So thanks on that. Okay, back to today's session. For me, the best way to understand the range of nonviolent tactics and their potential is by exploring classic winning campaigns from the past. I guess that the hope is that if we understand the ingredients of a success in past campaigns, we can perhaps apply that wisdom to current campaigns and win. Following this historical series, this is the last in the historical series, we hope to move on to contemporary campaigns. We'll be mounting face-to-face training sessions on nonviolent action, and we'll also have virtual and live sessions on tactics and strategy in contemporary campaigns, including ongoing local campaigns in the Greater Toronto Area, and actually in Hamilton, Greater Toronto Area, and also the campaigns of the climate movement. So what to expect today? Well, following my very brief comments, there'll be a 25-minute documentary on the Chilean case. And following that, Arnd Jurgensen will act as facilitator to share, and you can share your reactions to documentary, with the basic issue being, what can we learn from this case? Dr. Arnd Jurgensen is a lecturer in international relations at University of Toronto, but he began his academic career as a Latin American, so he knows a lot about Chile. So near the end of the session, Arnd will call on me to facilitate summing up what we've learned this evening. So a word on the procedure. In our last session on lunch counter protests in Nashville, it was disrupted, as many of you know, by racists using pretty vile tactics. We've put into place a number of safeguards this time, so we don't think that we'll have any problem. But no one can share screen except the co-host, and everyone is muted until we come to the discussion period. If you'd like to make a comment, reaction, and please do use the hands up symbol from the bottom of the screen, or else you can pop a question into chat, which is being monitored. Just one further thing, if any of you would like to join our nonviolent working group at Science for Peace, no matter where you live, you are more than welcome. And you can contact me at sfp@physics.utoronto.ca, or you can join via our website, which is at scienceforpeace.org. Okay, so now we're going to move on to the film, and following that, Arnd will take over as facilitator. Thank you, Melissa. Please run the film.
Spring 1983. For nearly 10 years, General Augusto Pinochet has ruled Chile unchallenged.
We needed someone to dare to say to the dictator that he was a dictator, and to say that the dictatorship was a dictatorship, and confront it on its own turf. Not on the turf of arms, just to dare to tell them that what we had in Chile was wrong, and that it had to be changed.
Pinochet came to power in a 1973 coup that left the elected socialist president, Salvador Allende, dead.
During the first months of the military regime, the number of people detained in prisons reached more than 40,000. At least 3,000 individuals were assassinated, executed, or their bodies disappeared forever.
Ruthlessly eliminating any challenge to his authority, Pinochet's rule cast fear into every corner of Chilean life.
It was a very permeating paranoia, and it was with everyone. Everybody had experienced some sort of repression in their family, and they were very cautious. My husband and I would go to a social gathering, and he wouldn't introduce me to anyone. And I said, well, why won't you introduce me to people? And he said, oh, we don't do that now. It's too dangerous. You don't really want to know people's names.
Fear, terror. If you have people afraid, you can control them. And Pinochet, if something he will leave in history, he's the man of terror.
Executions, disappearances, and prisons keep the dictatorship in power for 10 years. By 1983, a severe economic crisis has pushed unemployment to 30%. As Chileans feel they have nothing left to lose, open opposition to the regime becomes thinkable for the first time. The first signs of opposition appear at the heart of Chile's economy, in the copper mines of the Andes Mountains. Miners are amongst Chile's best paid workers in the country's largest and most lucrative export industry. Their leader is 29-year-old Rodolfo Seguel, a payroll clerk at Chile's largest copper mine, recently elected president of the National Labor Congress. Seguel wants his members to take the first step, a nationwide strike.
10 years had gone by and nobody had gone out into the street. We had to see what reaction the country would have, and then to see if the country would dare to do this. Our goal was to open people's eyes and to tell them, we can do it. It is possible. We can do this.
A week before the strike is to begin, Pinochet's troops surround the copper mines. Seguel knows that there will be bloodshed if the strike goes forward, They change their plans. Instead of a strike, they proclaim a national day of protest. With only a few days to prepare, they must mobilize not just union members, but the whole population.
I remember that morning. At the beginning, you didn't know if someone was walking slowly, driving his car slowly, or walking slowly on the sidewalk, because he was just taking a walk or because they were protesting. Until finally at noon, it was so obvious. It was so obvious that everything was slower. It was so evident that the city started to close down.
As darkness falls, no one knows whether the final overt act of protest will succeed. At exactly 8 p.m. it begins, tentatively at first.
And the next day, there was a sense of sort of, what did you do last night? Did you see it? Oh yes, I was out banging my pots and pans with my neighbors. And so there was a real sense of complicity all of a sudden in a society where each human being had literally become a complete island.
And the next day, when the protest finished, at the first meeting that we had, we decided to have a protest every month. And we did that during 9 or 10 months. Every month a protest. And that was chaos for the military regime, because we didn't protest with arms. That gave us more power.
A mood approaching euphoria grows as the protests grow every month. People start to believe that mass demonstrations alone will bring down the dictatorship. Mainstream opposition protests are strictly non-violent. Brutal police repression of the monthly demonstrations seems intended to intimidate, to stop the movement, but it has no effect. In early August, one day before the fourth protest is scheduled, Pinochet installs a new interior minister, Sergio Harpa. Harpa is instructed to begin a dialogue with the opposition. In a contradictory gesture on the same day, Pinochet deploys thousands of troops in the streets of the capital. An ominous prelude to the next day's demonstrations. Security forces break up the August protest with unprecedented force. A police statement admits that 17 civilians have been killed. The actual number is much higher.
It was very violent, and that's when I realized that we couldn't keep on going down this road. Because the violence was too strong. Pinochet had 16,000 soldiers on the streets of Santiago. More than 80 people were killed, and the population started to rebel.
Shocked by the bloodshed, the new Cardinal of Chile's Catholic Church offers to host the dialogue that Pinochet has promised.
At the first meeting, Gabriel Valdés told me that he had to give me a document. And I told him that I would not take this document because it is an agreement that you drew up this morning, demanding the resignation of the President of the Republic. That you don't recognize him as being legitimate. And if the President of the Republic is not the legitimate president, I have nothing to do here, because I represent him. So this is where it all ends, right here.
Buenos días.
As Pinochet celebrates his birthday in November, he has stopped Sergio Harper's meetings with the opposition. Harper's small concessions, limited political activity, the return of exiles, an end to book censorship were too much for the general. The dialogue is over.
No hubo ningún resultado.
No, there wasn't any result. It was very frustrating.
No cambió para nada el régimen.
The regime didn't change at all.
El propio Harpa después.
And Harpa himself was left there as a politician with no importance.
De ninguna importancia, diría.
In fact, the control of the government passed on to much harder hands.
Opposition groups have been naive to think that Pinochet would negotiate an end to his own power. Protesters have not loosened the dictator's grip, but they have shown Pinochet they cannot be crushed by force, and they have opened up political space they will use to organize against him.
Viva Chile!
In late November 1985, 500,000 attend the largest political rally in Chilean history. Gabriel Valdez speaks for 11 opposition parties and the Catholic Church. The National Accord, formed to lead a non-violent transition to democracy. Valdez warns, if we don't support the National Accord, we are heading towards civil war. In Chile's poor neighborhoods, the poblaciones, a low-intensity war has already begun. Hard times have fallen hardest here, making fertile ground for Chile's Marxist and Communist parties. Not many have personally taken up arms, but the ideology of violent revolution is accepted. The regime sees the poblaciones as enemy territory. Young men in the poblaciones are rounded up, interrogated in stadiums and fields, and hauled off to prison without trial. Hundreds are never seen again. Pinochet's human rights abuses have drawn the normally conservative Catholic Church into the conflict. Though the clergy takes no political position, the Church protests against the torture, killings, and disappearances, and preaches non-violent methods.
If you use violence, then you have to have the force to defend yourself. Whatever you impose through violence, you have to defend through violence. That's why we think that violence is the strength of the weak, because they don't have arguments, they don't have moral authority. So whatever you achieve through violence, you have to defend through violence.
Monthly protests turn violent as the radicals confront police, handing Pinochet the excuse he needs to come down on all opposition. Mainstream factions are harshly criticized for their non-violent methods.
In those conditions, when you are repressed by violence, of course there are people that think that the only way to face violence is through violence. But that was, in our understanding, absolutely out of any possibility of succeeding.
In late summer of 1986, the prospect of full-scale civil war becomes real. Chilean intelligence uncovers a cache of arms in the northern desert and traces them to a guerrilla group affiliated with the Chilean Communist Party. Markings show the weapons have come from Cuba. Pinochet says it's proof that his opponents are preparing a revolution. A few weeks later, heavily armed guerrillas attacked General Pinochet's motorcade on a remote mountain road. State news media report that 5 presidential guards have died, but do not mention Pinochet. Four hours later, the dictator appears on television to describe the attack. He appears unfazed by his narrow escape and returns to the presidential palace with his customary swagger. The episode reinforces his image of invincibility.
It really polarized, I think, between, you know, are we going to go for a really serious attempt at armed struggle, the way we've seen in Central America, with a huge toll on human lives and suffering that was part of that? Or are we going to try to find some other way, which was very nebulous, and so this search began to find some way that could provide some kind of an exit from this impasse.
Pinochet's own constitution calls for a plebiscite in 1988, giving Chileans the right to vote yes or no to another 8 years of military government. Isolated and overconfident, Pinochet always assumed he would win. But after 5 years of organizing, the non-violent opposition sees an opportunity.
For the first time, we knew that if Pinochet was going to remain in power, there's going to be a plebiscite, and you have to say yes or no. Therefore, we say, look, if we prepare ourselves, we can defeat Pinochet saying no.
And we said, how are we going to trust the dictator that has been doing all these things, and he will count the votes, that he count the votes as the votes are? But we realized that we had no other way, and we said, let's move ahead in that direction, and let's create all the conditions to avoid any fraud.
Thousands of volunteers take to the countryside in a door-to-door campaign to convince Chileans that they can vote no without fear of reprisal, and that the results will not be rigged. They are greeted with suspicion and skepticism. To create the appearance of a fair vote, Pinochet and the generals write new election laws. Any opposition party that can collect 35,000 signatures will be allowed to have poll watchers, a critical factor to prevent vote fraud, and be given 15 minutes of television time every night for 4 weeks before the voting.
And I said, look, if you register, I'm going to be on TV. And the day that I'm going to be in TV, I will tell to Mr. Pinochet that he has to go.
Primero dijo usted, General Pinochet.
After his party is certified, Lagos gets his chance when he appears on the Chilean equivalent of Meet the Press.
Le voy a recordar, General Pinochet.
He holds up a newspaper clipping in which Pinochet is quoted saying he will not be a candidate in the plebiscite.
Y ahora le promete al país otros 8 años, con tortura, con asesinatos, con violación de derechos humanos. Me parece inadmisible que un chileno tenga tanta ambición de poder de pretender estar 25 años en el poder.
His daring performance makes Ricardo Lagos a celebrity overnight, and his performance foreshadows the significance of television in the coming No campaign. Pinochet's vulnerability is human rights. The No campaign plans television spots to emphasize torture, death, and prison. But US political consultants advise them that dwelling on the fears of the past would be a turnoff.
They developed a campaign that was future-oriented, a campaign that focused on bread and butter issues, and it was a campaign that ultimately caught the Pinochet regime and the supporters of the yes vote by complete surprise when it was aired on the first night in that last 30 days of the campaign. Porque nace el arco iris después de la tempestad, porque
porque quiero que florezcan mil maneras de pensar, porque sin la dictadura la alegría va a llegar, porque pienso en el futuro, voy a decir que no.
That no, what was meaning yes to democracy was meaning yes to more social justice and not no to injustice.
And la alegría ya viene, meaning joy is around the corner. It was an invitation to a country that belonged to everyone. The idea that we were going to defeat the dictatorship, not with a gun, but a pencil. That this road was going to be traveled without hate, without rancor, without vengeance.
On television, the No campaign is a sensation. Images of a bright future without Pinochet. The TV spots earn credibility with skeptical viewers, with compelling references to the suffering inflicted by the dictatorship.
People used to rush home to watch those spots. I used to rush home to watch those spots. It was like, 15 minutes where, they use real words to say real things, Torture is torture, and it happened here. And after all these years of denial, there it was for the first time on television. Poverty exists.
Buenos días, don Aníbal. Deme 2 marraquetas.
Little old ladies don't even have enough money in their purses to buy a tea bag for their afternoon tea.
Voy a llevar té también.
¿Cómo no? 2 bolsitas.
Una nomás.
No más miseria.
La información de este minuto para el diario de Cooperativa dice que a muy pocas horas de que se inicie el plebiscito en Chile, voto no. No. Voto sí. Sí. No.
Opposition poll watchers now perform a parallel vote count based on sampling techniques. By fax and telephone, the numbers are fed to computers in Santiago. By early evening, they project the no has won decisively. A small independent radio station announces the results. Ensconced in the presidential palace, Pinochet says nothing. Suspicions of electoral fraud grow as hours pass with no announcement of the vote tally. At midnight, Pinochet's Navy, Air Force and police commanders enter the palace. General Fernando Matei, Air Force commander, tells reporters, it appears the no has won. A public statement that warns Pinochet to accept the defeat. Within seconds, his remarks are on the radio.
The great strength was that it did really come from ordinary, extraordinary people. And they really did put their lives on the line, and they really did come out, and they really were willing to take a stand.
I think that we, in the world, we really live on power. And what we would like to is to live on authority, personal authority, moral authority. When you act based on power, well, if I have a gun pointed at me, I'm going to say whatever you think and you want. After you take your gun off my head, I'm going to do what I want.
Lo vivió
How people lived that moment. And they lived it without hatred, convinced that they had been the participants, the actors. Here there was no charismatic leader, no guerrilla, no vanguard that would say, I did this. The sense in Chile that night was that they had done it themselves. How many? 7 million.
Well,
over to you, Arnd.
Well, that was quite an inspiring 30 minutes of documentary film watching. And a very good illustration of the power of nonviolent action to confront violent regimes. And I think that something that stood out to me in that portrayal is a couple of things, and I won't spend too much time on it since my main function is to be the moderator between your questions. But one thing that stood out to me is, in particular, the extreme use of violence against protesters fairly early on in the regime. That made the regime, above all else, associated in the eyes of much of the public with violence. And in that regard, made a sharp contrast between the regime and its opponents. And one of the things that I think needs to be added to the documentary is that, as important as the referendum was, in many ways the referendum represented the beginning of the struggle, not the end of it. It was an important victory, but Pinochet was not inclined to give up power. He made various moves to have the military authorize his reimposing military rule and disregarding the plebiscite. And was not backed up in that context by his top generals as well as the top police force. In that regard, the nonviolent tactics that led to the victory in the plebiscite had an important function in breaking down the consensus within the regime itself, and I think that's a very crucial component of why it ultimately led to a transfer of power. In and of itself, the plebiscite, I don't think, would necessarily have done so. The other thing that's important to note in that regard is that the hesitation on the part of the regime after the plebiscite to act upon its results once again brought out fairly extensive demonstrations throughout the country, which once again were met with considerable violence by aspects of the regime. And I think that did a lot to further undermine the regime. And it is to the considerable credit of the opposition parties that they stuck to their nonviolence, that under those circumstances of relatively extreme confrontations with security forces, they were not tempted to resort to a violent response. And I think that was an absolutely crucial component to the story of why the Chilean transition ultimately succeeded. But let me leave it at that for the time being and see whether there are any other comments or questions or responses to this documentary. If you have any comments, please feel free to go to the reactions at the bottom right of your screen. And there is one, if you click on it, you'll see raise your hand. And when you raise your hand, we will be able to see it and we will be able to unmute your microphone and you will be able to make your contribution. So please feel free to. Ian has his hand up. Melissa, would you unmute?
Yes. I just like to raise one point. I found it, like you, an inspiring movie. But I was interested particularly in the comments on the role of the mass demonstration, because it seems to me that with many, the implicit threat of a mass demonstration is potential violence against the regime. And here we had examples of people coming together with a mass demonstration, but rather ending up with a rather different and more positive vision for the future. Now, I think that is really interesting, and it strikes me that it almost might also relate to another aspect of the film, which is the relationship between Pinochet and his top generals and the police, and how you break down that relationship between the person who controls the monopoly of violence and the people who are actually carrying out that violence. If you can change their attitudes through that kind of demonstration, then maybe you're on the right kind of path for real change. So that was a lesson I took from it. And I think possibly comparatively, there are many other examples around the world where that kind of thing has not actually happened. In Hong Kong, for example, mass demonstrations were very frequent, but were overtaken. The peaceful aspect of them were overtaken by violence between the demonstrators and the police. So that, for me, was a very interesting aspect of the film.
I completely agree with you as far as that goes, and I think the comment that you're making is points to a certain extent to the growing tactic that I've seen start to develop in the 1990s of the use of agent provocateurs in mass demonstrations, essentially to turn a otherwise peaceful demonstration to violence, in part to discredit it, and in part to justify extreme police actions against it without having the popular backlash that would otherwise be incurred by a turn to violence by law enforcement. And I think that's a very dangerous tactic and strategy that regimes do use in order to maintain themselves in power, and we certainly need to be vigilant in that regard. There was one comment posted by Barbara Burkett on chat asking how it was that the regime allowed the television postings in the lead up to the plebiscite. The background there is, I think, that the regime was overconfident. Which is why they allowed the plebiscite to begin with. Pinochet was convinced that he would win the plebiscite. And the other thing that should be said is that the opposition parties were only allowed the television spots late in the evening, while the regime could broadcast its advertisements throughout the day. In that sense, the opposition had a serious impediment to being able to reach the masses. But in part, perhaps that perception of the unfairness of the access to the media may have further undermined the view of the legitimacy of the regime. There were some other hands up.
That was mine, actually, Arnd, to mention what Barbara's question was. So go ahead. But if I may, I'll put my hand up. And I can't help but there was one tiny little mention in the video about American consultants. And how can one think about Chile and Pinochet without thinking of Milton Friedman and the Chicago Boys and the, you know, the sort of the launch of neoliberalism as we know it, who won the Nobel Prize for Economics. And at the end in 1988 and 89, said something like, the experiment worked very well because the military junta was replaced by a democratic government. All of everything that was done under Pinochet's rule is completely erased.
I think that's a very good point. I think that in part it's a means of sidestepping an issue that might make North American audience is less receptive to the message of the nonviolent struggle against the regime. But yes, it's absolutely, from a historical perspective, to mention the American involvement in bringing about a transition to democracy without mentioning the American involvement in bringing about the coup and then supporting that government for the next decade and a half, if not 2 decades, is pretty galling. I completely agree.
Kissinger is another name that comes to mind.
And it is interesting that as far as discussions of the Pinochet dictatorship are concerned, there is still a marked difference between how it is discussed in academic circles and elsewhere when compared to the Argentinian dictatorship, which is universally described as a disaster, whereas invariably somebody has to sneak into, oh well, but they did a good job on the economy in Chile, which, given the description in the documentary, is certainly questionable. Yes, the dictatorship was very good for certain people in Chile, but whether it was good for Chile as a whole is very, very much debatable.
Right. Yes. Mm-hmm. And yet it seems at this point to what Milton Friedman birthed and experimented with in Chile is kind of it's the default economic way of doing things. So little has changed.
The term that is most often associated with it is the Washington Consensus.
Exactly. Exactly. Thank you.
So you're absolutely right as far as that goes. I mean, the other thing that while we were talking about the American involvement, we can certainly include and perhaps should talk about the direct involvement of the United States in the coup in '73 to begin with. But I think one of the reasons why it's so important to understand this coup is because it's a culmination of a process that began really with the Cuban Revolution in terms of the American thinking about Latin America. Prior to the Cuban Revolution, the basic approach by the United States was one of hemispheric defense, where the idea was that the militaries of Latin America would be integrated with the American military in order to defend against a invasion by the Soviet Union or something along those lines. The Cuban Revolution and announced with it the Alliance for Progress on the part of the Kennedy administration, which was the response to the Cuban Revolution, was essentially to put forward what has since become known as the doctrine of national security with regard to Latin American militaries, and change the orientation of Latin Americans away from the idea of hemispheric defense to the idea of subversion. In other words, toward directing the attention of the military to internal repression of threats to stability as opposed to external threats. Basically, that began a process of militaries taking over, starting in Brazil, and from there sweeping through Latin America, so that by 1976, there were 3 democracies left in the Western Hemisphere south of Mexico. One was Costa Rica, which was indeed admirable. The other was Colombia, which was in the midst of a civil war. And
dubious democracy.
That's right. And the third was Venezuela, which was the kind of model that the United States was putting forward as for democracy. In other words, elite-dominated 2 parties that alternate in power, but essentially collaborate in maintaining stability, meaning maintaining a very small, largely westernized elite in power.
I have a question from Michael Beer, Arnd.
Yes.
Successful massive nonviolent action often changes a society. Besides splitting the Pinochet regime, how is Chilean society changed by the success?
I mean, I think that there's others that could comment on that as well, and perhaps we have some Chileans in the audience that would be able to comment on that more accurately than I. But I think that one thing that has most definitely changed is a generally greater appreciation of the fragility and the importance of maintaining democratic institutions, and essentially willingness to come to the defense of those institutions, which I think is a very important development in that regard.
Mm-hmm. Leela Zand is waiting.
Yes. We'll have to unmute you. Hang on for a second. Melissa will unmute.
I guess it's on a mute now.
Yes, you are. Yes, you are.
Hi, thank you for the film and for the presentation. I am from Iran, and you know, in the past couple of months, Iran was a chaos, basically, a lot of violence, mainly by the government, but also demonstrators showed a lot of violence. Based on what I've seen here on this film and many other stories, including the Iranian Revolution in 1979, which was really nonviolent, basically, is it very wrong if I say, till the moment that the government, those who have the ultimate power in places like Iran or many different places in the Middle East or in South America, until the government doesn't decide that they want to use nonviolence or they want to allow the other side to be heard, we don't see, you know, we keep continuing seeing the violence in just erupted within the movement. Because, you know, what I've seen in the Iranian Revolution, for example, many people talk about it as a nonviolent movement or nonviolent revolution in 20th century. And yes, not many people have been killed, not many violence, but the main reason was because Shah of Iran left very soon. But the Islamic regime right now, they are just keep killing people. And any demonstration, even nonviolent demonstration, which unfortunately hasn't been much in this late past couple of months, but this violence continues. Until the people within the government started to come toward the demonstrators, until the people from within the power, they decide not to leave the power. So what else can we count on?
That's a very difficult and important question to answer. I think that the most important thing that I think to keep in mind in that regard is that. And I think the films that we've seen over the last month all point in the same direction, is that nonviolence is the most potent weapon of the weak. And that violence inherently puts political struggles onto into an arena where those that hold power have a serious advantage, and the idea that I mean, it happened in Cuba under very peculiar circumstances. It happened in Nicaragua under very peculiar circumstances, and whether the results there were necessarily consistently positive is debatable. But in general, I think that the idea of winning state power through a violent struggle inherently entails major problems, not only in the sense of that I think that the odds are stacked against the party trying to gain power by or the popular struggle trying to gain power by that means, but also by virtue of the fact that those that lead a violent struggle invariably become bureaucratized and institutionalized as wielders of force. And I think that's what the priest in the documentary was kind of referring to, is that anything that you win by power, you have to defend by power, and in that regard undermines the overall purpose of the struggle. So I think that in many ways it is important to reinforce the importance of nonviolence as a means of reaching concessions. And I think that in that regard, in Iran, once again, insofar as there's violence on the street, those that defend the regime tend to see their defense of the regime as justified by the existence of that violence. If there is no violence apparent other than that orchestrated by the agents of the government itself, questions invariably start to arise in some individuals within that regime, and the process of breakdown starts to begin. And I think that I think is an important lesson that unfortunately was not as well made as apparent in this documentary as I think it ultimately should have been.
Yeah, thank you. May I have a second question? Just following.
I'll make a comment on that.
Yes, please do, Richard, and we'll let you follow up after.
Okay.
Yes, I was just going to say that basically, you know, the question is what does a nonviolent movement do in the context of a violent government? And it comes down to courage, discipline, persistence, and tactical flexibility. Those are the four things they have to do. Hopefully there has been training beforehand so that people are more attuned to the variety of tactics of nonviolent action. Above all, it takes courage, an enormous amount of courage to engage in nonviolent action in the face of a dictatorship.
Yeah.
Because obviously, if people start fighting, then you've undermined your case to a very large extent. You give a rationale for the government to respond violently. You have to persist no matter what happens, which is very hard to do. And you need to have flexibility in tactics. So if one tactic is not working, then you move to another tactic. You've got the flexibility of moving. You have to, you as a movement, the leadership of the nonviolent movement has to be able to shift gears and be able to communicate the shifting gears to their followers. That basically is, you can't rely on the government to give up using violence. That you might suggest the government decides not to use violence, because if violence is working, they're not going to stop using violence. So you have to make it so that it doesn't work, so that you begin to use tactics that undermine the main support base of the regime, basically. That was my brief comment on that important question.
Leila, did you want to quickly respond? You ask a follow-up question?
Me, yeah. I just wanted to ask, is there any way or anything the nonviolent demonstrators could do in order to make the government officials to change their mind and, just leave their government or the circle that they are around it? Is there any way besides just constant nonviolent actions?
Personally, I think that's the key. I think that's the key because violence ultimately, as I said before, puts it onto the plane where law enforcement and those that control the means of violence have the upper hand. There was another question. I'll get to you, Leanne, in a second. There was another question I think was a very good one on our chat function by Mary Ellen. Asking about who was responsible for preparing the people for nonviolent demonstrations. And I think that's a very good question. I think that in part, the early violent demonstrations and the attempt to start a violent insurgency against the government and the violent government responses to that, I think reinforced the futility among the population of trying to win overpower by violent means. Beyond that, what's unique about this, and I don't have a very good answer, and I'd be welcome to hear others that may be more familiar with that, but what is kind of unique in this regard is that there wasn't as much of a centralized leadership in this case as there was in the case of Gandhi's salt marches, where there was a clear example of one person that was that articulated the strategy and that had a committed group of followers that were willing to abide by it. The same thing is to a certain extent true of the lunch count sit-ins. They were well organized by individuals that thought out every aspect of it and so on. In the case of Chile, I think it was a more diffuse movement that started in with the labor union movement in the copper mines. And again, to get back to Richard's point, the shift of strategies to avoid violence was evident in that they called off the strike because they anticipated severe repression and so on, and instead shifted to the demonstrations. And the demonstrations initially took the form of banging pots, making it difficult to have a violent response to them and so on. And that slowly escalated to violence, which in turn undermined the legitimacy of the government more than the legitimacy of the protesters. Rama, you have your hand up. Hang on for...
thank you. I was just keeping quiet, really. I did not know what to say. but I just have one point to make, that when we think about non-violent action or protest, there are at least two things to think about. One, who is in the opposition? A non-violent protest against a democratic government is different than a non-violent protest against a military dictatorship. The second thing is the time frame. How fast you want to make the change. And I give you example that Gandhi, when he left Africa and went to India, it took him 28 years before he had the courage and the support of the people to say, quit India movement. He could wait. He knew that even if India could become free tomorrow, nothing will change because the country is not prepared for democracy. So I think one of the fear of always non-violent protest is that the worst situation is the military dictatorship. They have the power in their hand, and unless you are dealing with a very benevolent dictator who thinks, well, my time is up, it is likely than not that he or she is going to, clobber the nonviolent protest. So I think this is the price that one of the problem always is that Gandhi was not in the government or asking for protest. He was not interested in politics. He was trying to change the politics. So I think when we think about nonviolent protest, who is against you are protesting, what's the time frame? So for example, it may be very hypothetical that if it is possible for people to have protest, not in continuous basis, but tease the government and take on and show them that we are not afraid and the time is up for them to go for democracy. So I think there is no easy answer, but I do feel that such question has to be debated, that non-violent protest can and cannot succeed depending upon how fast the changes we are looking for and who is in the opposition.
I think that's a very good point. I think the only thing that I would add to that point is that, as Richard mentioned early on in our meeting, I studied the breakdown of democratic or authoritarian regimes in Latin America fairly extensively as a doctoral student. And one thing that stands out is the extent to which authoritarian regimes can collapse very quickly. And it's not usually because the dictator has changed his mind. It's usually because the regime falls apart for various other reasons. And when it falls apart, has a great deal to do with what's going on in the rest of society. And in that regard, having elements within a authoritarian bloc break away from it because they can no longer associate themselves with the violence that is being inflicted on the population. When there is no return violence from that population, is I think, a very important component to those kinds of transitions. Leanne, you had your hand up.
Yes, there are a few things that have showed up in the chat. One is that Evelyn Tischer is asking for good books on nonviolence, and that and some people have already started to put in the chat some of their favorite books on nonviolent direct action. Michael and Leela have then also had a conversation about the role of women, I'll reduce it that way, in the situation in Iran, and how that the initial leadership by women was taken over by young men who were using violent methods. In my work in war zones around the world, to me, when we're looking for, this is partly in response to what Rama was saying, to what extent are women participating? I've spent a lot of time in Sudan, and the sort of first kick at the can of overcoming Omar al-Bashir was very much, in fact, the years leading up to that, it was about the participation of women and the iconic figure of the Nubian Kandaka. So to me, that was always in the groups that I worked with, the communities that I worked with, it was the success, and there are various ways of determining what that looks like, but small movements at the beginning, sometimes large movements, is all about the participation of women, and that is a big indicator as of whether or not, as Stefan and Chenoweth would agree.
Well, I think violence against women is also somewhat more offensive when it's put in front of people, as again illustrated by the beginnings of the Iranian uprising, was in respect to one woman that was targeted by the regime for not wearing the hijab, and I don't know whether something similar would have happened had they killed a random man somewhere for similar reasons. So I think that gender component of these struggles, I think, is something very important to keep in mind.
Anna Gorka asks about, did church and state have much or any binding contracts or overlap by the 80s in Chile? For example, state-funded church operated education, their role as a large ally with resources seemed not insignificant, outspoken even.
Again, the church, I think, in terms of my understanding of the church in Chile, has generally been a conservative force, and was initially rather hostile to the government of Allende, certainly, less so, obviously, to the Christian Democrats, but as such became one of the bigger supporters of the dictatorship in its earlier years. And the break between the dictatorship and the church, I think, is in that sense one of the key components of the breakdown of that regime. And let's face it, most of the generals that were in Pinochet's cabinet were practicing Catholics, so that has some impact.
Very true. One other, Michael Beer suggests, and I heartily recommend this, the new documentary, The Movement and the Madmen. It was shown in the States, not in Canada, though some of us had an opportunity to catch it, and last week, and highly recommend it.
I'll have to look that one up myself. We are now at 5 minutes past 8, and probably it would be a good time at this point, unless there's somebody else that wants to put their hand up real quick, to pass it on to closing remarks by Richard.
Okay, well,
I could just add in here, Elizabeth Lee has said very true about, I think she's responding to what I was saying, because for women, it is more about justice overall, not about power, something men together end up using violence to keep their place.
okay, well, I'll just make two brief comments before passing it back to the audience. The first is that the ouster of Pinochet as president was a victory, but let's bear in mind it was only a partial victory. First of all, Pinochet remained the head of the armed forces until 1998. The civilian leaders were not allowed to promote or dismiss any senior officers in the officer corps. And in addition, so the army remained as a potent force in the background, constantly menacing the government. Secondly, the Constitution. The Constitution that the civilian government inherited was a 1980 Constitution, which was constructed by people designated by Pinochet. And it was a constitution that was designed to keep the left at bay and to ensure that the right wing remained strong enough to veto anything from the neoliberal capitalist path. It's a very important factor. The Constitution was filled with kind of institutional constraints on government. For example, 9 military officers became members of the upper house of the Congress. So the 9 military officers, along with the minority conservative elected senators, was enough to block any possibility of constitutional change. And any legislation had to be negotiated by the government, consultation for 9 years, government, had to be negotiated with the right wing, which meant that nothing very much, they were constantly frustrated in what they could achieve. They couldn't even win very much of a change in the tax law. They made slight changes. The right made slight concessions there. So it was a very, the Constitution was an enormous limitation on the government. Actually, the full victory over Pinochet only took place around 2022, beginning in 2019 with massive protests to do with the Constitution, leading to finally a constitutional commission being set up. One constitution was too radical for people, so it was voted down, and more, I guess, moderate one, you might say, came into power. So it's really only last year that the story is over. The Constitution was changed, civilian preeminence is now established. It took a long time. I think you should bear that in mind. Now, in terms of the lessons to draw from the case, I'll just mention one. There obviously, there are way more than one, but the one that struck me very briefly, and that is one thing I alluded to earlier. That was really important. So the miners, which historically had been a very powerful group in Chile because of the copper mines, and mainly copper mines and other mines as well, they were well organized as a trade union early in the 20th century, links with the Communist Party, extremely militant, suppressed in 1973. Well, they in 1983, following a terrible economic crisis in Chile, came to the fore. Let's remember that the neoliberal model in Chile, as instituted by Pinochet in 1974, was a disaster. It led, because it was the full open market model, both domestically and internationally. It was the whole thing, and it resulted predictably in disaster, in that the Chilean banks and others took out loans in American dollars. There was then a high rate of inflation. They couldn't pay them back. All the banks went bankrupt, basically, had to be nationalized by the government of Pinochet. And the GDP dropped 15% in 1 year. So this led to a lot of misery among the population, a lot of protests, leading to the copper union calling for a general strike. Now that was a very bold move. It was too bold, and they realized it was too bold because the army they simply sent in the battalions to each of the mining towns, and they would have absolutely decimated any workers that went on general strike at that time. So they moved to this day of protest, which I think is a brilliant move. Actually, it was no longer just union workers; it was population. They called on everyone just to slow down. Now, slow down during the day, and then go home, and then bang pots and honk your horn at exactly 8 p.m. So what was the army going to do about that? I mean, there's nothing they could really do. They couldn't stop that, and it was enormously important because it gave the sense of people a sense they were no longer isolated individuals, that there actually was a community, that many other people agreed with them that the dictatorship had to end. And so that then led to a protest march, which was violently put down in 1986. And from there, because of the bad publicity and so on, and the move up to the referendum, there was some opening, some allowance for some campaigning by the opposition parties, which reformed then. So they then carried out a very program. I mean, using music and all kinds of funny tactics to get people to realize that they could vote no, and in fact they did. So it was a brilliant in the sense of the tactical flexibility of the leadership. It seems to me that's one lesson I would draw from this case. I wonder if anybody else has any any other one they'd like to suggest.
The only thing that I would add to that is that aside from the constitutional constraints, there were a couple of other major flaws with the transition, one of which is that Pinochet made it, when he left power, made it absolutely clear if there was even the slightest attempt to hold anyone in his regime accountable for the human rights violation, that would be the end of the democratic game. In other words, the military would resort to overthrowing the government immediately. In that sense, there has never been the kind of truth and reconciliation and accounting for the violence in Chile that there has been elsewhere, including to some extent in Argentina. The other thing, of course, and you somewhat alluded to the economic disaster, is that the newly democratically established government's first obligation, under the circumstances under which it took power, was to impose various IMF austerity programs in order to pay back the debts that had been incurred under the dictatorship, and in that sense was constrained in its ability to address the inequality that was at the basis of the instability in Chile to begin with.
Michael asked a really important question earlier about the impact of nonviolent action on the population of Chile. And normally there is some kind of impact. What I understand to be the case is that the military and that terrible period of repression had an enormous impact on the population and on the politicians too. Many of the politicians had been, the leaders of the political parties that were banned in 1973 were either killed, tortured, imprisoned, or in exile. Some of them were in exile, the communists especially, were in exile in Soviet countries, and they didn't like their experience on the whole very much at all in those countries. I think this wasn't what they had in mind for the future. So the population was really scarred. It was like a traumatic event, this 1973 and the period afterwards. So to begin with, the civilian leadership of the major parties, the Socialist Party and the Christian Democrats, were very much afraid of populism, of the people making demands that could not be met. That this would lead to another coup d'etat and this terrible experience being repeated. So there was not an attempt to build up the grassroots on the part of the Socialists or the Christian Democrat coalition, because they were regarded as radical and not that would create problems for the regime. So it took a long time before the Chilean civil society managed to reconstitute itself. Before 1973, it is generally assumed that Chilean civil society is one of the strongest in the world, with all kinds of organizations of every type under the sun. And those were repressed, leadership was decimated. It took really into around 2005 is when protests began, first of all with school children, university students protesting about the education system. And that kind of protest sparked an enormous response way beyond this issue of the privatization of education, the tremendous inequalities, to bring in all kinds of other issues. So this process went on to 2005, 6, and then again in 2010, a major series of demonstration and protests, and then finally in 2019 with a massive protest. So it took decades for civil society to rebound from the kind of repression that the Pinochet regime imposed upon them. But I think today that you have a fully alive and a fully lively civil society, and with defense of human rights and much more inclusive society than ever was before.
So I was just wanted to recognize Michael's list of possibilities of where you're going to find some good resources for nonviolent direct action. And so you can save your chat so that you can go back later and have a look in case you missed any of them. But he mentions Nonviolence International in particular, Meta Peace, ICNC, International Center for Nonviolent Communication, Nonviolence News, Waging Nonviolence, Commons Library. All of those are great sources for the kind of things that people were asking for. An interesting thoughts from Clark Joseph. What is the human cost of the Monroe Empire doctrine? Is the Earth a sacrifice zone to facilitate American hegemony? Interesting question to ask today in these times. Oh, thank you, Michael. I didn't get it right. International Center for Nonviolent Community Conflict. Sorry, yes.
Thank you, Leanne. Are there any other...
Well, go ahead.
Well, if there are no other comments, then I think we can bring to an end our meeting this evening. I'll perhaps pass it back on to Richard to make some final closing comments. Thank you all for coming out and joining us for this very interesting documentary and very interesting discussion. And I hope you continue to maintain your interest in Science for Peace and the various webinars and so on that we put on. Richard?
Yes. Just a final word that we hope to set up face-to-face nonviolent training within the near future, which we'll tell you about, and also have sessions in May, beginning in May, on local nonviolent actions. Again, learn from actual ongoing struggles, as well as at least one, perhaps two, on the climate movement, on the strategy and tactics of nonviolence in the climate movement up to date, which have not been very successful. Has been very steadfastly nonviolent, but not with much in the way of results. So we have to question, what else could be done by nonviolent action on the climate movement. We also will deal then with the other side of the climate movement, which is the violent, those who talk in terms of need for sabotage and violence, and what relation that has to nonviolence. And so we'll have those up and ready in May and June, and we look forward to seeing you then. So thank you very much for coming.